Hello and welcome to Addis Matters, our show on Ethiopian current affairs with me, Begna Simesso. The assassination of the Oromo political activist and singer Hachalu Hundessa in June 2020 had dramatically changed the political landscape in Oromia region and the whole nation. We shall analyze the public reaction, the government response and future implications to the election and beyond. I have two guests following the developments on the ground very closely. William Davison, senior Ethiopia analyst at the Crisis Group and founding editor of Ethiopia Insight, and Dr Mengistu Aseffa Dadi, dentist by profession but commentator on Ethiopian and Oromo affairs. Thank you both for your time, views and insights, and welcome to the show. Since Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came to power in 2018, the whole Oromia has gone through at least two major incidents that brought millions of people to turn out on the street in protest that has resulted in the loss of lives and destruction of properties. In October 2019, when the political activist Jawar Mohammed claimed to be surrounded by security forces, and in June 2020, when the singer Hachalu Hundessa was assassinated. On both occasions, as I said, millions of people turned out to the streets and property were lost and lives were lost as well. Dr. Mengistu, if I may, let me start with you. This year, in October 2020, lots of people were expecting the same to happen during the Irreecha celebration. As a result of that, I think the government took a very heavy-hand approach on celebrating the incident. Have you celebrated it? And how did you see the Irreecha celebration this year?
Thank you for the chance. The Irreecha of this year was not as colorful as it used to be, mainly because of the corona pandemic that is plaguing the world. And I think the government has taken the opportunity to curb the possible violences that might the celebration of the Thanksgiving festivity. So it was not as colorful as it used to be.
William, do you have any observation of Irreecha this year? I mean, it used to be celebrated with millions of people in the last few years, particularly like last year, 2019. It was celebrated both in Addis and in Bishoftu. But this year, there was a heavy military presence.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, as Mengistu says, this is a combination of the effects of COVID-19 and the restrictions that necessitates, but then also the political environment. And actually, I think it's significant because we can see that if we think about the 2016 Irreecha, where there was this terrible disaster, the protests, the government response, and then lots of people dying in a stampede. I mean, it almost feels like we're back at a similar kind of stage now, where rather than people being hopeful and joyous about this annual celebration of the Oromo people, instead it's seen more through the lens of, is this going to be a major security incident? So there's that sort of worrying comparison with the past. Obviously, that was a time of sustained anti-government protest. And I think looking forward and thinking about what's just occurred and then how the government has managed the Irreecha festival, these very tight restrictions on public transport, to stop people coming into Oromia, stop people coming into central Addis Ababa. Unfortunately, I think that's probably a sign of how things are going to develop in Oromia, because an increasingly sort of securitized response to the situation there seems likely, especially in the run-up to the election, whenever that is next year.
I don't want to dwell on Irreecha that much, Dr. Mengistu, but as way of introduction, do you think this will have any consequence for the ruling party because of the heavy control, as William said, of blocking people to come to Addis and to go to even Horar City or Bishoftu? Do you think it will have political consequence for the ruling party?
It's not particular to Irreecha. The political environment in the country is not that much safe for anyone to gather at certain places. So the government is taking major security deployment to regions and areas where people gather. So not particular to Irreecha, but the current, especially after the assassination of artist Hachalu Hundessa, the political development has dramatically changed. So it's going to affect the whole political environment of the country, not particular to Irreecha or what has happened during Irreecha, but the entire political environment is not that much stable. So the government is taking these securitization procedures, and that's going to affect the country's political transition as well.
So it's not specific to Oromia only?
But Oromia might be significantly affected by what is going to happen. But I don't see it as particular to Oromia. What is happening in Tigray region is also a worrying sign in the country's political space.
I'm from Bishoftu. I was born in Addis, but I grew up in Bishoftu in Debre Zeit. And I've seen Irreecha celebrated for many years since my childhood. And in my understanding, there is a bit of evolution, the evolution of Irreecha. In the old days, it used to be purely religious. In the last, 15, 20 years, it became more of like a cultural gathering, a Thanksgiving. And in the last few years, since 2014, 2015, 16, the political involvement, the political influence has been growing. William, do you see any consequence out of this, some known prominent artists such as Galana Garumsa, for instance, was denied access to get into the Irreecha Park in Addis? Do you think it will have political consequence for the ruling party?
Well, I think I would see the management of Irreecha, in line with my previous answer, as part of this sort of developing political problem. So I don't see it as a thing apart, but I just see it as the latest incident where the message that the opponents of the government in Oromia, which we understand to be quite a significant constituency, they will see this as another example of how, rather than this being a moment of liberation for the Oromo people and increased autonomy for Oromia and all the rest of it, instead they will see this more of a continuation of the practices of the past. And we can go back as far as we like, but we can maybe just think of, we had the protest movement, 2015 to 2018. The new prime minister came in. There was a lot of hope, and then since then things have not worked out as those opponents hoped. Their demands have not been met. Maybe in terms of increased autonomy, the Oromo language becoming a federal working language, some movement on the Addis Ababa issue. And then we had the sort of what was perceived as political repression, the merging of the Oromia ruling party into Prosperity Party, seen as a blow against autonomy, and then we moved into the election and COVID phase, and of course that's ended up with these very popular Oromo nationalist leaders being arrested. A month after that, when the news emerged that Jawar Mohammed was sick, there were protests in Oromia and security forces shot dead a number of people. So that's been the build-up to this, to the Irreecha, and then we have Irreecha, and we do see this heavy security management. So it's not a thing apart, it's just the latest development in a clear trend.
All right, thank you for laying out like that. Let's get back to the Hachalu issue. Dr. Mengistu, we remember that Hachalu was assassinated June 29, 2020 at 9 p.m. The report came on social media a few hours later, including a condolence message from the Prime Minister. But before dawn, people were on the streets already in many parts of the region. Roads were closed in major towns. Buildings and even residential houses were on fire. Violent public reaction followed. Why? I would like to understand why. Is there something that we are missing? What's going on in the social psychology of the Oromo youth in particular to turn out and do such a thing, you know. It's not like a protest against the government necessarily. Individual houses were burnt on fire, business establishments were burnt to the ground, and peaceful citizens were assassinated. What are we missing? I mean, what do we need to understand how the Oromo youth feel about these things?
You know, the assassination of Hachalu Hundessa has exposed the already existing fault lines in the country's political space. There is an ethnic line and a religious line, and there is also political polarization in the country. The assassination of Hachalu didn't bring anything new to the space. It just exposed the vulnerabilities that is existing in the country's political environment. His tragic assassination has brought people to the street and made them react in a very dangerous way, in sometimes very hard to understand way. So I would not comment on what has happened in their social psychology, but the mobilization that has been happening in the past years might have affected how people should react. And they took Hachalu's assassination as a sign of killing Oromo's hope, because Hachalu had been the soundtrack of Oromo resistance. He has brought the question of justice in a very unique manner. He used his talent to bring the question of Oromo, the question of justice to the political environment. So his assassination has been taken as a sign that the Ethiopian state is no more favorable for the Oromo youth. So the anger and the distrust, the betrayal, the feeling, at least the perceived betrayal, might have made them react that way. But there might be many explanations for that, because I don't know if there were some arrangements that or some group that might have used the opportunity to cause that kind of distraction. So, but I would not comment on what has happened on the...
It's very difficult to understand. Yeah. William, the Qeerroo is at the center of this. Some people somehow equate, I mean, the Qeerroo, some love it, some loathe it, most fear it, that's obvious. No one in Oromia dares to speak against it. But for the others, the Qeerroo is a different thing. The PM, the Prime Minister even said once the government will put a remembrance to the Qeerroo and other youth movements such as the Fano, the Zerma, and the Jato. Shimallis Abdisa claimed Opidio is the one that organized the Qeerroo in one of his speeches. Jawar used to act as an unelected leader or as a sort of contact point of this youth mobilization. But for non-Oromos, as I said, the Qeerroo is a different thing. We know of Iskandar Naga, what he was trying to do. He was trying to get it registered as a terrorist organization by the UN Security Council. Some people try to equate the Qeerroo with the Janjaweed militia of the former Sudanese president Omar al-Bashir. Some even equate it with the Interhamwe group in Rwanda. But we are seeing similar trends even in the US. We know of last week's discussion, debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. There were this, sidelined youth movements, the white supremacist groups such as the Proud Boys and the Antifa on the left side were mentioned as well. And obviously Donald Trump failed to denounce that group. Is this a global development? Is it a global trend politically? That's what we're seeing in Ethiopia?
How long do I have to answer this question?
Go ahead. It's a very long question as well. Yeah.
I mean, I think, for me, your description of the Qeerroo contains the core of the problem. Because you're talking about something, and I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to. Qeerroo means Oromo bachelor, right? A male bachelor. And then we have these various actors that you talked about that have been sort of claiming credit for the Qeerroo, claiming that they were orchestrating the Qeerroo or condemning the Qeerroo. Or what are they condemning? They could all be condemning or claiming or praising entirely different things as far as I'm concerned. So I think we have to be a little bit more specific, or at least have some agreement about what we are referring to here. I guess my understanding is that the Qeerroo was something which probably originated from elements of the OLF, And then as it sort of gathered pace, other Oromo activists came on board, most notably Jawar Mohammed, with his ability to, to attract a large following and coordinate and all the rest of it. So he sort of acted as the voice piece of the Kero, the mouthpiece, sorry. And then we have the establishment, the OPDO, as you mentioned. And then I think we clearly had some sort of merging of a protest movement backed by the diaspora with this internal EPRDF struggle. So I think that's where kind of Shimele's and Abi's comments come in. But then moving 2 years on and talking about what happened in wherever, in Shashamene or Batu or Dedar or out in Bale, well, I don't think that was one organized, coherent group that was engaged in those protests, those acts of property destruction, and then those killings that occurred. I think there were...
So you think it's spontaneous? It was not properly organized? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I don't know. And I don't think anyone knows, actually. I think that there are important local dynamics in each of these locations. I think there's an element of orchestration. There's an element of planning. There's also, and I think this was maybe partly referred to by Mengistu, there was an astonishing failure of security response, as there has been on other occasions during similar incidents in Oromia, whether that's the local police, the regional police, the regional special police or the federal police, or the military. So there's some sort of explaining to be done there, definitely. But maybe just to kind of cast back, which I think maybe is a more helpful way to address this issue. If we're talking about, why did this happen? What are we missing, as you were saying? Well, I think, we can see strains within the Oromo nationalist ideology, which is an anti-imperialist ideology, right? It wants to sort of deconstruct the Ethiopian state, let's say. It wants to overcome those historical injustices. Now, part of that relates to the settlers that came with the imperial expansion into Oromia. This is the Neftenya class, or part of it was the Neftenya class. And we know this has been a huge part of the narrative and has become hugely controversial. Now, if we take that to the Hachalu incident, what do we know? Well, we know about the Oromia Media Network interview and the controversy surrounding Hachalu's comments. There's no particular clarity on it, but we know that some people considered Hachalu to have criticized Menelik and the Neftenya system very, very strongly. And then there were allegations that Hachalu was threatened by Neftenya. There were others saying he was threatened by OLF Shane. So we can see, Hachalu being in the middle of this, the different sides with their own polarized interpretations of history and of current events, imposing or projecting them onto Hachalu. So what happens when Hachalu is assassinated? Well, a large portion of this Oromo youth who've been indoctrinated or believe in this anti-imperialist ideology, they believe that the Neftenya class was an oppressor and the neo-Neftenya class is still an oppressor and is contributing to their economic and political injustice as they see it. Well, they blamed them for Hachalu's assassination as a collective. And that led to the anger being directed towards their neighbors in these locations. I'm not saying that's all that was going on, but there's a clear ideological strand and therefore a clear motivation for some of the violence that we saw from the Oromo youth. Call them Kero if you want.
A very interesting explanation. I think probably one of the best, I guess. But Dr. Mengistu, going beyond history, I mean, are there other ways of explaining the situation within Oromia at the moment? I mean, William mentioned the Neftenya issue is a very sensitive one in Oromia and also in other parts of the country as well. But most of the arguments usually are made on historic grounds, historic grievances, historic injustices. What else do we need to understand about in relation to the Hachalu incident of what happened in...
Buying William's explanation of the situation, I wanted to add something. There is this economic fall in Oromia. There are many of these youth are unemployed. And they are also indoctrinated in a way that anti-imperialist or deconstructive narrative. And there are also signs from the government that makes them perceive that it is against them, at least at the level of perception. Another is the the friction between Oromo elites by itself has also contributed to this. I think this is a major development as well. When you see Jawar and Opidio people, and for that matter the OLF, there is a clear divergence to their way of understanding, at least to the way of doing politics. And there is also a bigger difference in their narrating, in the narrative they develop through media, and the interpretation of what has been going on during the last 2 years, especially the Prime Minister Abiy's renovation of the palace and the formation of Prosperity Party. Some of these developments during the reform has been interpreted very widely and in a very divergent way. So it might have contributed to this, but the economic question is not being mentioned by anyone, so it is going to be an addressed issue, and it's going to be a cause of a problem as well. So I understand this through this broad concept.
And I think that economic issue is, as I see it, it's a broad problem of
Beyond
being
Oromia.
a huge mass of people with, aspirations that are not met and who are suffering difficulties and are easily instrumentalized, let's say. And then there's also, as I see it, this economic injustice issue. So there's quite a strong dose of economic nationalism to Oromia nationalism, as there was throughout the protests. That's partly why we see commercial properties being attacked. People think that they control the business networks, that they have the capital, and that they're not paying their fair share of taxes regionally. They're not paying the due amount for water, land, labor. So there's the two strands to the economic. There's the masses, the dissatisfied masses, and then there's the economic ideology that comes with it.
Interesting.
But one of the developments in reform, what we shouldn't forget is that the government or whoever is in power should do something, especially in for example, concession. The government has conceded to many of the injustices that had been done during the EPRDF. But that gave them hope, that gave the Ethiopian population hope, as Bill already said. But that hope dissipated with some security failures or some happenings through what has happened during the reform. So that hope is gone, so people have been desperate, and that might have also contributed to the...
Interesting. Economics is at the center of it. William, let's review the government's response to the post-Hachalu assassination incident. As you said, as you mentioned, in some parts of the region, the local authorities did very little or almost nothing. But at federal level, immediately after that, there was a heavy crackdown against opposition forces, particularly from Oromia. We know of the imprisonment of the non-politicians, the Jawars and the Begna and the others, but it didn't stop there. How do you rate the government's response to the whole situation?
Well, I think, as you said, it's been quite forceful. We can say that for sure. And I think we can see from the statements from the Prime Minister's office, is this sort of sense of running out of patience. We've had this transition. It's been messy, partly because we have been so sort of magnanimous in terms of not using the same authoritarian methods as in the past, so use of lethal force, mass arrests, this type of thing. And then also we saw the government saying, we gave you freedom of expression. We granted you liberty, and you've misused it. And that's kind of directed towards the political elites, the opposition elites, but also to the people and the protesters at large. So there's definitely a sense of the government running out of patience. And I think that broadly explains what we've seen. To be a bit more specific, we've seen three segments to this crackdown, if you will allow me. Obviously, people have different views about how justified the government action has been. But we've seen the arrests of 9,000 people. Like a large portion of those, I would imagine, are people who are out on the street when there was property destruction and killing. Then we've also seen the arrest of a number of officials, including police officers. So, formally for complicity with the protest or maybe dereliction of duty. And then we've seen the elite arrests of the opposition leaders. So I would sort of categorize them into three. And then within the government, we've also seen some significant people removed. And so we have to kind of disaggregate what's going on here. When we have characters like Jawar and Bekele, for example, well, they were right in the mix here. You know, we know Jawar was integrally involved in the October violence. He was a central figure. And we know that him and Bekele were out on the streets with this very messy scene with, you know, Hachalu's body and the debate about where he was going to be buried. So, you know, hardly surprising maybe that given the circumstances, they ran into trouble with the authorities. Just sticking with Jawar and Bekele, if we look at the charges that have been laid against them, well, it's not just for the October incident and for the July violence. It's also accusing Jawar specifically of training a terrorist group in Egypt. So we're sort of being told by the authorities that they've been monitoring Jawar, sending Oromo kids and Kamant and Agao to Egypt to train as terrorists, but they didn't do anything until this July violence. So, you know, there's different elements to the charges there. Some of them are more surprising than others, let's say. Then we move, you know, in the political elite, we move to Eskinder. Well, again, you know, given Eskinder's political platform and approach, when we have a situation where Oromo youth, Kedo, are marching into Addis and causing destruction on the way, we know Eskinder's going to be involved in a certain amount of mobilization of his people, Addis residents, his supporters, in defense. And given Eskinder's relations with the city authorities and with the federal authorities, again, it's hardly surprising that he ran into trouble because of that action. But this is essentially a sort of natural part of Eskinder's political activity because of his opposition to ethno-nationalism and Oromo nationalist politicians. So it's not really surprising. If we look at Lidettu's arrest, that is surprising. Because Lidettu, as we understand it, is not someone who's involved in violent politics. He's a fairly pragmatic, centrist figure. They've laid various charges against him and ended up with a firearms offense. That looks rather politicized. And so there is definitely, you know, serious grounds for concerns about that. And the only other thing I would say is that, you know, there will be an ongoing debate about the legitimacy and the justification of all of these arrests. But the political problem, as I see it, is in terms of the public perception of them, and particularly the perception of the Oromia public and the Oromia electorate. The people I've spoken to dismiss the idea that you can have an election which means anything in 2021, because most of the Oromo nationalist leaders have been arrested. And I haven't even mentioned the OLF and leaders. We're yet to see what charges they've been accused of. But it's going to be very, very hard to run a competitive election that's accepted by a large portion of the Oromia electorate because they think that these arrests are political.
Interesting. Dr. Mengistu, I mean, the government chose William properly, I mean, very well described how the government reacted to it. But there are some oppositions, I mean, especially coming from the Oromo elites, certain groups of Oromo elites. This should have led the government towards more of, you know, opening up the space to have an open discussion with different political groups. Shouldn't that be the way rather than imprisoning 9,000 people and prominent political figures? What do you say to that?
I think there is a gap in understanding the situation. The government's assessment is, as William described very well, is the government's assessment of the situation is that they have been very tolerant towards some of the ways of engagement of the political actors. It is as if they have given them all they needed to participate peacefully, and they have already jeopardized the situation and posed a serious threat to the national security of the country. This is the assessment of the government. Whereas the assessment of the other political parties is the development of an authoritarian system on the mercy of people's struggle. I think there is this gap. So the government has reacted in a very harsh way, especially post Hachalu's assassination. And I don't see the government's rationale for opening up anymore, because their assessment is already as if the timetable for tolerance is expired. But how the engagement of other political actors, especially post Hachalu's assassination, is somehow radical. It questions the legitimacy of the government, especially with relation to the postponement of the election, as well as the development after Hachalu's assassination within the state, has pushed them to the core, to the extent that they claimed the state is already a nyonoftenya, it's not Neonaftanya in Oromia means as if it is against the existential fate of Oromo. So it is a make or break struggle. So there is this tension, a growing tension. So I think that will be hard to imagine, but the way forward, as you said, is finding a middle ground, at least for some ease of the political situation, so that a competitive election would be imagined, at least. Or the government must do something shy of miracle to make the Oromo population believe that the charges against the political actors are legitimate. Something small, like very shy of miracle, that makes them perceive as it is illegal thing. So that's what I say.
It feels like, I think, the government moves from one extreme into another. I mean, back in June or July, it was doing almost nothing, and the security forces and the police were just watching when cities were burned down, basically. I mean, particularly in Shashamane and Batu, for instance. But after that, I mean, it's the other way, opposite. They are not even allowing people to go to, to celebrate and to this Thanksgiving parades. We are approaching the end. William, you have touched on it briefly, the implications of these actions for the future, to the election and beyond. You said, I mean, who's the government running against in Oromia in particular? I mean, the OLF is fracturing, OFC prominent leaders are in prison. As you said, thousands of people are also in prison. Who is PP standing against in the election now? Are we back to square one?
Yeah, I mean, there's always a lot of, it's always very difficult to predict these future political events, especially, considering how eventful and volatile things have been. And I don't think the situation is any different now. So I think it raises quite an interesting question, because, the opposition maybe was just beginning to find its feet in Oromia, and now it's had its head chopped off, basically. Now, where does that leave us? Because we know that Prosperity Party, we think that Prosperity Party is not going to be particularly popular in Oromia, particularly in the rural areas, let's say, might have some support in urban areas. We don't think that the Oromo nationalist opposition is going to be very well organized because of these arrests and the sort of disaffection that causes. But that leaves the question, well, who are the people going to vote for? So perhaps we are still going to see a considerable opposition vote in Oromia because of this, the support for the OLF, for example, is not based upon its excellent political organization, is it? It's just based upon a long-standing sort of symbolic importance and support for the OLF. So are we going to see that sort of turn out, that sort of support for the opposition? But then, of course, is the question, how are these opposition parties going to react? Are they actually going to compete in this election? Or are they going to say that the government made it completely uncompetitive by arresting their leaders? So a lot of uncertainty, I would say. But I think the only way to sort of be assured of an election which would be successful would be to have some sort of process of political amnesty, and then a process of political negotiation, so that these parties could compete on a level playing field. Without that, we might still get a significant opposition vote, but there's a serious risk that the opposition just reject the election as something controlled entirely by the government of the ruling party.
So by political amnesty, are you saying like releasing this prominent political leaders?
Well, I'm not advocating for that. I'm saying
it
that
could be one of the solutions.
If you wanted to be assured of an election that would be considered free and fair by the Oromo opposition, then I think that would be a vital component, yeah.
Mengistu, do you have anything to add to it?
I basically have no other thing to add, but election happened in 2015 in Ethiopia, but it meant nothing because the opposition were not participating, and the opposition just came out after that, especially after the announcement of the master plan of Addis Ababa. It just led to massive protest that has removed the prime minister and brought this new prime minister to office. I don't see a different thing right now, because the perception of the people is that we are back to square one. I think it's more than that, because the labeling is not just Wayani now, it's a Neonaftanya system. It's not it's not liberation per se. It's also an existential threat. This has to be somehow negotiated. I don't know how, but there should be sort of like a thing that makes the people believe that the government is serious about democratizing the state. I would rather add one thing. Whenever you think of reforming a society, a state, an economy, and the politics, you should go through three important steps. The first one is political liberalization, where you allow many political actors to come to the stage and debate, present their idea. You free up any possibly arrested personalities due to their political opinions, and you make the media somehow free. And that was somehow what we have witnessed in the last 2.5 years. And the second part is a very important part, which is the democratic and somehow fair election that brings into office a legitimate state, legitimate government. And that legitimate government will continue with step 3, which is going to building an institution, credible ones, security, law enforcement, and judiciary, whatever. So Ethiopia is already at this first stage. The political liberalization was started back in 2018, and it is somehow facing this challenge, structural challenges, particularly in the last 2 years after some euphoric time. Those structural challenges is, number one, the government, the way the government handled, for example, Sidama referendum, and now the Tigray election. It's one of the 2 major structural challenges to the Prime Minister, considering the federation, the possibility of credible election, and the possibility of overall democratization of the state and the building credible institution rather than revolving around some small groups or some one-man show. So I think Ethiopia's political development is a very strange one, and something serious should be done to save the first step, to make the election credible and building institution more sustainably a feasible possibility.
Thank you. So you're basically saying we're back to 2015 again, sort of.
My assessment is that the perception of the the developments are not that happy, and the political space is visibly very tense, and the engagement of the political parties, especially the opposition, are very critical, and I don't see this very divergent polarization will help any transformation into a stable state. So it's a very worrying development.
Thanks so much. One last question for both of you. Rebuilding efforts, particularly in those areas that are burned down, such as Shashamane, Hausa, and Deder, or the other ones. What the government has been doing is mainly is given a sort of symbolic or cosmetic response to, remember Hachalu naming streets after his name, and squares, parks, university campuses. But the lives of, I don't know, thousands of people in these areas is still in jeopardy. And what should be done to rebuild life for these people and to build investor confidence, in particular in Oromia region? Mengistu, let me start with you, and I'll conclude with William.
I see this in a very, this is a very small happening in a very broad development, political development in Ethiopia. There have been displacement, internal displacements in Ethiopia due to political violences, and the government's efforts has been visible and at times criticized by observers, and it should be done in an overall way that ensures the safety of the people, and this should be prevented, not healed. It should be prevented in the first place. And so the human security that is being jeopardized here is part of the overall development in the recent years in Ethiopia. Added to this, you can see floods is devastating. Its development is very worrying, and desert locust, coronavirus. So the overall system should be considered, and I think that needs a political stability to address, so that the government effectively responds, and the security of the possibility of the future displacements might be hampered. So I think that should be seen in that. So the government is busy in doing that, but I don't know if that is effective, because I don't have this objective assessment of the thing.
William, concluding remarks.
I mean, really what Mengistu said, I think, obviously these are tragic incidents and we need, communities to rally round and support these latest victims. But ultimately, if we look at Ethiopia in this broader sense, I mean, there's something like 20 million people who are in need of emergency assistance at the moment. So we could see the states and the government's failings there. We've talked about a little bit about the government and the state's failings in terms of protecting people in terms of the security response as well. So it doesn't really look like we have a government that's capable. And instead we need the broader Ethiopian community and society to rally round and support these people. And as Mengistu said, the issue here is not about treatment, it's about prevention. And if there is something that the government can do, it's to play its part in addressing the political problems so we don't see a repeat of these events. Because ultimately we could have all sorts of rebuilding activity. The next time there's some trigger event, like the incident we saw at Jawa's house, like arguably a minor thing, then we have this very significant trigger event of Hachalu's assassination. Anything in between that, well, we're liable to have exactly the same situation occur again. So that's what the government needs to focus on preventing.
Thank you very much. Thank you both for your contribution. William Davison, Senior Ethiopian Analyst at the Crisis Group and Founding Editor of Ethiopia Insight, and Dr Mengistu Aseffa Dadi, commentator on Ethiopian and Oromoo affairs. Thank you for watching. Next time we'll be back with another topics and another guests. Until then, goodbye from me, Begna Simesso, and the team at Addis Matters.